Hello, everybody. All right. I'm going to apologize for the glare and I'm going to apologize for the noise, but I'm in an outdoor location. I've been out and about all day, and I'm currently outside MU's engineering department. They got a really cool balcony with kind of like a park bench, plastic park bench and seats and shade, more or less, right? And access to wireless. So let's get to the point. There's this persistent new thing being said about Bruce Lee that I just don't believe. Okay, and when I was a young teenager in the 80s, I was in kind of like full hero worship mode, but also there's always a part of me that says, hey, he's just flesh and blood. He doesn't have superpowers. He's not some amazing super being. Some of it's got to be hype. And originally I just thought to myself, well, he's just an amazing actor, an action star. He wasn't much of a fighter, but what sort of began tipping the scales, aside from the many testimonials of his students, right, and associates, were everybody that was anybody in any of the martial art magazines, in the martial art movies. They were all the top karate fighters, and some of them boxers of the time, right? And they all talked about how amazing Bruce was as a martial artist and an instructor. So that got my attention, and they all talked about experiences they had fighting with him. Man, am I sweating. You know what I'm going to do, folks? I might shift vantage point over here just to get a little bit less glare. This is a little better. So, then, Bruce Lee was long gone before I got to the scene, and I saw the movies, and I was just like amazed by the movies. There's a powerful, fast, lithesome, graceful thing about his movement, right? His movements were instantaneous. His movements were explosive and powerful and controlled. And anybody who's put effort into learning martial arts can just see how awesome he was. One of the greatest declarations I heard about Bruce Lee was from one of my instructors. In high school, I trained at 2 different places. Plus, I sparred with a whole bunch of friends, and I trained on my own from the magazines. I did everything I could. And Rick Hahn, who was a 3rd degree black belt in the American karate system, the way of the sphere, S-P-H-E-R-E, sphere, globe, round. I had gotten a couple stripes on my white belt. I think I had 2 stripes on my white belt, and that took 8 months. He often asked if after the main class that he taught, if some of his senior white belts, beginner students, we were all young, wanted to come over to Mercer County Community College and help him teach another class, and we could demonstrate stuff and so on. And so we did that, and it was fun. And in between classes, he was putting on a knee brace or something, and I was talking about I love watching Bruce Lee's movies, and Rick Hahn, his eyes just perked up. And I don't call him sensei because nobody used the term sensei over there. He wasn't into Oriental terminology, neither was anybody. And I said, yeah, and you could tell, even though he was the bad guy and he lost, you could tell Chuck Norris was pretty good too. He was almost as good as Bruce Lee. And Rick said, Chuck Norris is a pimple on Bruce Lee's ass. And I was like, well, he's pretty good. He's like, and he broke it down for me. He's like, look, watch the way he moves, watch his flow, his accuracy, his balance, and he talked about all the different attributes. And he says you can tell he was better. Anyone who says Bruce Lee didn't know how to fight, didn't have legitimate martial arts, doesn't know what they're talking about. And Rick, I highly respected Rick. I mean, he was another person that seemed almost superhuman to me, right? And yet with all the power he had in his body and all the amazing things he was capable of doing on demand, he was a nice guy. I rarely saw him get mad. Even when we in the class were acting stupid. So, I began really looking into Bruce Lee. I even studied Jeet Kune Do. This was in the 80s. Jeet Kune Do's been a big influence on me. And over time, I found so much validity in Jeet Kune Do and in Wing Chun. I've also studied Wing Chun. Like the Jeet Kune Do, often it was on and off, or I found someone that knew it and I said, let's trade this for that, Some Jeet Kune Do guys didn't have great flexibility. Same thing with Wing Chun guys. I said, I'll help you with flexibility. Sometimes it was my boxing experience. They're like, well, we box in Jeet Kune Do. I said, well, let me show you what I can do. And they're like, you're pretty good at this. I'm like, thank you. Plus, I knew training methods they didn't, So, time goes on. And, 1993 UFC, the MMA scene comes on. And again, it's been fashionable to talk about how Bruce Lee was never a fighter, never fought. And often this is by people that never bothered looking at all the archives, all the records, all the recorded data on him. The magazine articles. They're out of print. The books, they're old books, they're out of print. And so Bruce Lee bashing is in effect. And I'll admit, there's a couple things that I would have to revise. In the 80s, I was pretty sure that if Bruce Lee had fought in full contact karate, he'd be head and shoulders above anybody in his weight division, because it was all based on, a lot of it was based on what he did. Or parallel evolution. MMA, Bruce Lee wasn't a grappler. He had some grappling experience. He was part of the judo club at his university, and he was allowed to wear a black belt. But I think that was probably because he was such an expert in what he did, and they're like, sure, wear a black belt. That's how we rate you in what you do, and as an honorary sort of acknowledgement of your skill, sure. And I'm sure Bruce Lee, being the guy he was when he was, participating in club activities, probably taught more than he learned. He probably was like, well, here, let me show you this much more efficient thing. And Bruce Lee, being so explosive and everything, so charismatic, probably, wound up being more of a guest instructor now and then. And, there is the letters of Bob Baker that he, in his own handwriting with his own signatures, that he sent to Bob Baker, and detailing, can you send me some more drugs, can you send me some more weed and some mushrooms, and his involvement with cocaine, which may have contributed to his death. Yes, that does in a little bit take away from some of the admiration and shine that I had for him, but it also makes me realize he was a human being, a person, just like everyone else. But recently, this is very recently, this is more like past decade or so, a lot of people that never said this before, never came out and said this, or said it in a very modified way. They're saying, well, Bruce Lee never sparred. When we worked out, Bruce Lee and I, we never sparred. Chuck Norris says, we never sparred. And a lot of Joe Louis students, now that Joe Louis has passed, are like, well, yeah, he never sparred Joe Louis. And I recently, on Whistlekick Martial Arts, which some of his interviews, I can't stand Jeremy sometimes, but he interviewed Jerry Beasley, who I really did like the interview, and Jerry Beasley got in details about a lot of things. But Jerry Beasley, again, in the 18 months that Joe Louis trained continuously, weekly, with Bruce Lee, and during that time period, he went, undefeated. He won so many major championships. And his fighting style looked very Jeet Kune Do-ish. It didn't look like Shorin-ryu, which was his Okinawan background, and it didn't even look like boxing, to be quite honest with you, or other people's kickboxing. It looked like Jeet Kune Do. Jerry Beasley said, well, yeah, he hung out with literally all of the top champions, fighters in America of his day. All of them. Chuck Norris, Mike Stone, Lou Delgado, Joe Louis, Bob Wall sometimes. He hung out with all these guys, and he said he never sparred any of them. But he was charismatic and he knew a couple things, and so they kind of let him hang out with them. It's preposterous, guys. It's preposterous. First of all, it directly contradicts things that they said in print, being interviewed, and things that they've said on video. And what I notice is it's mostly the white guys doing this. I think there's a bit of, not prejudice. I don't think Chuck Norris and Joe Louis are prejudiced in a very obvious sense. I do think that, as white guys who are champions in their sport back in the 60s and 70s, I do think that they believe that they would be superior to a smaller Asian fighter. For sure, but they also had all learned their stuff in Asia from Asians, so I don't think that went too far. But I don't think any of those guys would have listened to Bruce Lee for more than 10 polite minutes outside of a magazine headquarters if Bruce Lee wasn't a fighter and hadn't fought them. I'm not talking extended sparring sessions. I'm going to say Bruce Lee was probably the kind of guy who said, well, all right, let's square off and try to score on me, and, probably very quickly shut you down with whatever he did. But, first of all, let's talk about all the people who said that they sparred with Bruce Lee. Let's talk about Jim Kelly. He was 6 foot something, much bigger, heavier, had all the technique that he needed. But he was nowhere near as fast as Bruce Lee. I mean, just watch his films, guys. He's not very fast. But Jim Kelly says Bruce Lee could shut him down, beat him, if they sparred hands and feet. And he said, in an interview, he said, Bruce Lee said, let's just box. And he beat him just boxing. You know how tough it is for someone that small to overcome that much of a reach advantage? All right. Lou Delgado said Bruce Lee was one of the most frustrating fighters he, quote, fought, and he couldn't land on him. Danny Inosanto, who was no slouch himself and was a high-ranking black belt in Kenpo with Ed Parker, and also in Shorin-ryu in the Army or some related style with Henry Slamansky, said the first time he met Bruce Lee, they sparred, and he couldn't do anything with him. He said Bruce Lee could counter everything I did without even trying. Chuck Norris said in an interview, he didn't say they had a sparring match, but he said, him and Bruce Lee were in the hotel, and after one of the tournaments, it was probably around 9 or 10 o'clock when the tournament is over, and they wound up training. He said training. Not exchanging, he said training and exchanging techniques. That means some type of training, right? Chuck Norris, he wins a tournament that day, and he's going to spend his time with an obscure, non-competitor. He said they exchanged and trained techniques, lost track of time until the sun came up. They sparred. For sure they sparred. Jerry Beasley says they every week Joe Louis would meet with Chuck Norris and Mike Stone and Bob Wall and a few other guys at one of Chuck Norris's studios. Chuck Norris and Bob Wall, they were affiliates, and every week they would get together and spar, and Bruce Lee would be there, and he would be coaching Joe Louis. This went on for 18 months. Plus he trained him in his house. Surely, a guy, I met Joe Louis, a very arrogant man, very combative, pugnacious man. He liked making enemies, and he hated kung fu people. I can tell you that. I had a kung fu baggy pants on and a kung fu shirt, and he immediately started making fun of them and said, "Oh, I look at those fancy pajamas." And I turned right around and I looked at his uniform, and I'm like, "Sir, you've got your uniform's just as fancy as mine and probably costs more. Matter of fact, could you please tell me how much you paid for your uniform, and I'll tell you how much I paid for mine, because I guarantee I paid less." And he just kind of stopped. But he was always looking for an opponent, Joe Louis. It's probably why he never really made it big in movies, right, and TV. Lou Delgado said he sparred Bruce Lee. Joe Louis, his boxing instructor Joey Orbio said Joey Orbio thought Bruce Lee could be top of his weight class, could be world class. He wouldn't have made that just by looking at Bruce Lee's shadow box or listening to him talk. All right. Jim Kelly says that there's quite a few top names that never talk about their sparring experiences with Bruce Lee because they'd be embarrassed. Okay? I believe when people say Bruce Lee wasn't a tournament competitor, but the tournaments of his day were pure tag, even though many of them being bare knuckle were 20 times as fierce as what we might have seen today, or even back in the late 80s. But that's not a criticism. Also, as someone who has done full contact sparring, who's boxed, who's kickboxed in a boxing gym, the New Brunswick boxing gym, who recently I'm moving on from Zen's gym. That'll be another video. But I've been coaching boxing, kickboxing, MMA. I've taken jiu-jitsu. Every single thing that Bruce Lee talked about as far as full contact training, the equipment you'll need, the exercises you need to do, the muscle groups you need to condition, right? Every single thing I've used in my training. And what that means is that he'd done it. He pioneered it. So yeah, would Bruce Lee be able to keep up with the fighters of his day? Probably not, because what they've been doing for the past 50 years is taking the legacy he left and developing it, leaving it to another generation who developed it further and left it to another generation and incorporated it with other things. Right? They've had the infusion of Muay Thai and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and all these things. Bruce Lee would have to do what he always did. If he had a young enough, strong enough body nowadays, he'd have to learn from what's around him, absorb what's useful, reject what's useless, and use his spirit to make another version of Jeet Kune Do that would work for whatever he chose to do. Whether it's simply making it another self-defense street fighting style or going into one of the combat sports. Right? But I don't believe for a minute Bruce Lee never sparred, because first of all, people around him talked about how tough it was sparring him. Joe Louis said he once saw Bruce Lee sparring a class, and he was sparring everybody and beating them with Shotokan. And George Dillman said Bruce Lee used to come in and spar his class and him and defeat all of them, right, with control. He never beat up on anybody. So it's silly. I think what's happening is many of the Bruce Lee fans that used to be part of the public discourse, we've opted out of the internet message boards, or we're just tired of them, or some of us just kind of never got into them. And a lot of these people that directly trained from Bruce Lee and learned from him and achieved greatness based on, some of their greatness, based on some of what he taught them, just kind of want to, as they get ready to move on to the great mystery, they're like, well, why I want everybody to think that, I was better than him. He wasn't that good. He didn't play that significant a part in my development. But it's not true. Have a nice day.